Hello, welcome to our latest video, based around a book that we just discovered about an hour or so ago, with the making of this video. It had some indication that there might have been some problems when it was being written, or it's being read by somebody else, because there's a lot of underlines which indicates that this person who read it may have been doubting what they were saying, or puzzled by what they had said. So that's what caught our eye, caught our attention, so we jumped in and started reading it. The Clarendon Bible, under the general editorship of the Bishop of Oxford, Bishop Wild and Canon G.H. Box, quite an old book. Old Testament, Volume 2, From Moses to Elisha, Israel to the End of the 9th Century BC, by L. Elliot Binns, published around 1929. There's a picture there of the hardship of nomad life in the wilderness, a Bedouin encampment. It's actually got Bedouin. Strange English spelling of Bedouin. Editor's preface. The first volume of the Clarendon Bible series to be published was part of the New Testament canon A.W.F. Blunt's commentary on the Acts of the Apostles. Since the publication of that work, they considered the question of the Old Testament and its place in their series. The inclusion of the Old Testament literature raised a number of difficult and perplexing problems. That's what we thought in general when we saw someone had read it, had underlined, like, as we said, they doubted what they were saying, the statements that they had made. Okay, and then it contains 6 volumes to be devoted to the Old Testament literature, 5 of which were said to be concerned with the literature proper, and 1 with the external history, and they were grouped according to the following plan. In this series, Volume 1, it was to be a manual history. Volumes 2 to 5 would deal with selected literature, illustrating the period under review. In each book, there would be a general introduction embracing about 50 pages, followed by a series of selected passages from the literature. The text of these passages, it says, wouldn't be printed, but will be indicated in each case by references to the revised version of the Bible, but notes and explanations would be given on the passages and so forth. And maybe this is where whoever read this beforehand put lines through it. In conclusion, we may repeat what has already been said in the preface to the New Testament volumes, which sufficiently set forth the general aim of the whole series, both of the Old and New Testament. Okay, here we go. It starts off here. In particular, we desire to draw a clear line between what is historic and what is not strictly history, and for this reason, the beginning of Israel's history and religion are traced from the Exodus. The consideration of the material found in Genesis is postponed till the final volume. These authors hoped and believed that the series of volumes on the Old Testament, which is now launched, will provide a real discipline and preparation for those on the New Testament. In conclusion, they may have repeated what has already been said in the preface to the New Testament volumes, which sufficiently sets forth the general aim of the whole series, both of the Old and New Testament. The problem of the teaching of Holy Scripture at that present time, presented many difficulties. It was a large and growing class of persons who felt bound to recognize that the progress of archaeological and critical studies had made it impossible for them to read, and still more to reach it precisely in the old way. However strongly they may believe in inspiration, they cannot any longer set before their pupils or take as a basis of their interpretation the doctrine of the verbal inspiration of Holy Scripture. So maybe this caused that person some concern. It is with the object of meeting the requirements not only of the elder pupils in public schools, their teachers, students in training colleges, and others engaged in education, but also of the clergy and the growing class of the general public, which we believe, or they believe, took an interest in biblical studies, that the present series is rejected. The writers would take responsibility, each for his own contribution only, and the interpretation was based upon the belief that the books of the Bible require to be placed in their historical context, so that, as far as possible, or may recover the sense which they bore when written. Any application of them must rest upon this ground. It is not the writer's intention, or this writer's intention, to set out the latest notions of radical scholars, English or foreign, or even to describe the exact position at which the discussion of the various problems has arrived or had arrived. The aim of this series was rather to put forward a constructive view of the books and their teaching, taking into consideration and welcoming results as to which there was a large measure of agreement among scholars. It was hoped to include a volume on the principles and logic of historical criticism, and that's verified by Thomas Oxon, Herbert Wild and George H. Box, general editors of this book in these volumes. Author's preface. The general purpose and scope of the series of commentaries to which this volume belongs have been made clear by the editors in their preface. Nothing further need therefore be furnished by way of explanation. It may, however, be as well to point out that in that preface the present volume is advertised as covering the period from the Exodus to the fall of Samaria. As Dr. T.H. Robertson has already dealt with the latter event in Volume 3, the decline and fall of the Hebrew kingdoms, in order to avoid unnecessary overlapping, this author had brought his own commentary to an end with the death of Elisha. This is on other grounds a convenient terminus, for Elisha was the last of the great prophets before the rise of a new type with the coming of Amos. The period which this volume covers is one of much importance, since it includes the beginning of the Hebrews as a nation and deals with the rise of the various institutions which gave to them their special character. In discussing the origins of laws and customs, the author has not hesitated to point out the primitive ideas and ideals which often lie behind them. The glory of the Old Testament religion is that from low and superstitious beginnings it has been able to rise to such pure heights of spiritual attainment. To set forth its humble origins is therefore to do it no disservice. And he carries on. Gives it thanks to general editors. Here's the contents. List of selected pages, illustrations, maps, introduction, a historical background, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Babylonia, Israel, Judah, etc. Notes to selected passages, principle of abbreviations, part 1, Moses and the Exodus, the early life of Moses. And as you can see, there's a heck of a lot of content there. Keep you interested for hours. If you're a real truth seeker, Bible believing truth seeker, and you want to know as much as you can, if not all, especially for when you go out there and you teach and you preach it. Okay. It's all about David, the divided kingdom, the schisms, the reign of Solomon, inscriptions illustrating Old Testament events, index of proper names, and chronological table at the end. List of selected passages. Here's an old carving, a panel of the doors of Santa Sabina, Rome. The carving is of the 5th century AD. List of selected pages again. List of illustrations. List of illustrations here again, and list of maps. The Near East, the Exodus, Palestine. Palestine is the centre of the trade routes of the East, Jerusalem, and a back-end paper. Here's some maps here of what it supposedly looked like, and it looks like the Hittites may have been the original descendants of the Assyrians. It's sort of a historical argument that they came in and invaded after Ashurbanipal was dead, right, and Assyria was at their weakest. Attacked them. Everyone attacked them from all sides, all those enemies that he kept at bay while he was still alive and kicking. And then later on they claimed to be the original inhabitants of Assyria, to the dislike of some Assyrians. He said, no, you weren't. Here's the region of the map of Exodus. Okay, those areas around it, around Egypt, etc. Palestine, map of Palestine. Introduction: a historical background of the period. In order to understand any books or series of books which claim to deal with actual events, it is necessary to know something of the circumstances in which they were produced, and above all, the background against which they arose. The labours of scholars, and in particular of archaeologists, enable us to reconstruct with considerable certainty the surroundings amidst which the Hebrew people originated and the influences which came to be exerted upon them. Yeah, we'll repeat that because we made a couple of mistakes here. Introduction. A. Historical background of the period, because it's quite important to know and understand this. In order to understand any book or series of books which claim to deal with actual events, it is necessary to know something of the circumstances in which they were produced, and above all, the background against which they arose. The labours of scholars, and in particular of archaeologists, enable us to reconstruct with considerable certainty the surroundings amidst which the Hebrew people originated and the influences which came to be exerted upon them. 1. Egypt. For the earlier part of our period, Babylonia and Assyria lie in the background. The predominant world power is Egypt, although its supremacy is challenged more than once by the non-Semitic peoples of Asia Minor and North Syria, whom we call the Hittites. After the death of Ramses III, 1167 BC, its political importance gradually waned, but for ages it still remained what it had always been since history's dawn, the leader of the world in civilization and culture. Yeah, it was one of the leading civilizations. There's also Babylonia, etc. Predominantly. During the supremacy of the Hyksos, the mysterious enemy from the north who held Egypt in subjection for some 2 centuries, little was done to promote the nation's real mission, unless indeed the destruction of the nobility in the struggle, since it left the way open for a new type of political life, was a contribution to their end. It must not be forgotten, however, that these Asiatic conquerors were the first to bring the horse into the valley of the Nile. Ahmose, born around 1580 to 1557 BC, was the ruler who expelled the invaders, and his reign marks the beginning of a new epoch, a period of some 150 years, during which the peaceful Egyptians were transformed by the inspiration of great leaders into a conquering army. On every side, the enemies of the nations were driven back. Nubia was subdued, the encroaching Libyans from the west were pushed back, and in Syria the retreating Hyksos were followed, and the arms of the pharaoh made their victorious way to the waters of the Euphrates under the great conqueror Thothmes III, 1501 to 1447 BC. Even this frontier was crossed, it's talking about the Euphrates, and Egypt was now without a rival to challenge her complete supremacy in the civilized world. Under his grandson and namesake Thothmes IV, 1420 to 1411 BC, it began to be recognized that not by conquest alone could the empire be maintained, and the pharaoh, by entering into an alliance with Atatama, king of Mitanni, began a new policy. It is possible that the rising power of the Hittites in Cappadocia had become threatening by this time, and that the 2 monarchs felt the need of reserving their strength to meet it. To Thothmes succeeded his son Amenhotep III, 1411-1375 BC. The most luxurious and splendid as he was, also the last of the great Egyptian emperors. It's by Breasted. You see, I could change later of these Egyptian texts, etc. Historian. The trade and wealth of Egypt had increased beyond all expectations. Each successive pharaoh had tried to outstrip his predecessor in the magnificence of his buildings, and the whole land seemed to have a future of unbroken felicity. But all this display and luxury were undermining the strong and simple virtues upon which the empire had been built up. Foreign influences were crowding in, for good it is true as well as evil, and away in the distant north there was the threat, perhaps not yet fully recognized, of a new foe. The Hittite advance was slow, but its most alarming feature was the help which the invaders were receiving from the pharaoh's own vassals. The measures which Amenhotep took to restore Egyptian prestige seemed, however, to meet the needs of the situation, and his last days were not disturbed by any anticipations of the coming storm or invasions of the hordes, the Hittites, etc. There followed Amenhotep IV, 1375 to 1358, the reformer and religious enthusiast. This amazing genius was the son of the late king and the low-born wife, whom, in defiance of tradition, he had taken to himself. She was a woman of great power and ability, and doubtless exercised much influence over her son. The latter, instead of spending his energies in restoring order in Palestine, where wandering tribes of Bedouin were combined with disloyal officials to destroy the last remnants of Egyptian supremacy, chose to play the part of a philosopher and religious reformer. It's talking about Amenhotep IV. In place of the multitude of gods worshipped by his predecessors, Akhenaton, as the king came to be called, wished to establish one supreme deity whom he named Aton, the solar ray. This reform of religion was not at all to the liking of the Egyptian priesthood, the centre of whose power was the sanctuary of Amon at Thebes, and in order to destroy their influence, Akhenaton not only persecuted them but even went to the extreme measure of building a new capital, the famous Amarna, is that the Tel El Amarna, to give it its modern name. His labour was in vain. The resources, material and otherwise, of the priesthood were too strong, and when the pharaoh sank into an early grave, it was no longer time before Thebes had regained its position and Amon was once more supreme. They dumped his god and went back to their many gods. Yes, they overran his one god idea and went back to their pantheon of gods, by the looks of it. The new capital was left to fall into decay, and it was from its ruins that the Tel El Amarna letters were recovered. See below paragraph 13 double F. Apparently they were recovered in Egypt, not Babylon, as stated in a previous video in regards to a previous book, series of volumes. But the time of Egypt's decay was not yet, and a period of fresh conquest still lay before her under the strong rule of the kings of the 19th dynasty, who now came to the throne. The 19th dynasty represented the national reaction against the Asiatic faith of Akhenaten and the governments of the country by Asiatic officials. See Early History of the Hebrews, page 158. The first of these to make any real serious attempt to extend his influence into Syria was Seti I, 1314 to 1292 BC. He pushed as far north as the Orontes, and after fighting a battle with a Hittite force, entered into negotiations with the king Mutalu, and there's a question mark there, and as a consequence a treaty was made which brought the war to an end. Seti, like earlier kings, was a great builder, in a number of new temples which he erected and endowed added to the already dangerous power of the ecclesiastical leaders. To him succeeded Ramses II, 1292 to 1225 BC, who came to the throne by supplanting an elder brother who replaced him. Warfare with the Hittites again broke out, and both sides, realizing the desperate nature of the struggle which was about to commence, strained every nerve to gather allies and to enroll mercenaries, foreigners, into the armies. Right? A great battle was fought around Kadesh on the Orontes. The two armies were of vast size for the times, Ramses having not less than 20,000 men and his adversary about the same. The experienced Hittite was, however, more than a match for his eager young antagonist, and succeeded in dividing his forces in such a way that, but for the intrepid valour of Ramses himself, an overwhelming disaster must have overtaken the Egyptian army. In the end, the pharaoh fought his way out of the trap into which he had been enticed, and even enjoyed a triumphal entry into Thebes on his return home. But at best the campaign had been indecisive. Further campaigns seem, however, to have been more successful, though from a scarcity of records we do not know how much as to their details. It is certain that Ramses marched his troops far north of Kadesh, whether in raids or in the way of permanent conquest is not clear. Some years of warfare were ended in 1272 by a lasting treaty made between Ramses and Hattusili, who had succeeded his brother Mutalu on the Hittite throne. The treaty was made on tolerably equal terms, but the growing power of Assyria must have made peace a matter of great urgency to the Hittite ruler and to the pharaoh. The treaty with Hattusili marks an epoch in the history of Egypt. It brings to a close a long period of fighting and expansion, but Egypt was still to be a pioneer in art and civilization. Ramses II was not only a warrior, he was also a great organizer and builder. He evidently recognized that for the purpose of keeping in touch with Egyptian interests in Asia, Thebes was inconvenient as the seat of the government. Accordingly, a new city was founded in the eastern delta, not far from Pelusium, to which the pharaoh gave his own name, Per-Ramses. Another store city was built not far from Bubastis. This he called Pithom. Compare Exodus 1:11. In addition, vast sums were expended on the building or completion of temples, and in some cases the destroying of old monuments to provide materials for the new, as well as in the endowment. On the death of Ramses II, his son Meneptah was already far advanced in years, succeeded to the throne and reigned for about 10 years, 1225 to 1215 BC. Although he remained at peace with the Hittites, his reign was marked by much trouble in the Asiatic dominions of Egypt, brought about by the allies of the Hittites and perhaps fomented by them. The pharaoh quickly invaded Palestine and by severe and vigorous measures reduced it to obedience. Amongst the names of those thus roughly handled was a people named Israel, the first time the word is found in history. Meanwhile, fresh trouble was arising in the delta. Here's a picture of carving of Akhenaton and his wife Nefertiti worshipping Aton. Okay. The sun god, or the sun rays, a relief in the Cairo Museum. The sun and its sun rays. Okay, I think it says that Egypt was invaded. Okay, meanwhile, fresh trouble was arising in the delta, which was invaded by a large body of Libyans and other tribes. It is of interest to observe that several of these peoples allied with the Libyans were probably of European origin. And down here it indicates the Shekelish, looks like shekel, right? Shekelish were perhaps the Sikels of Sicily, the Ikwish, the Achaeans. Other tribes were the Lycians, and the Teresh, who were not improbably the mysterious Etruscans, Tyrrhenians. Remember the king of Tyre? Is it the same? Tyrrhenians. The invaders were met by the troops of Egypt before they had made much progress, and after the famous Egyptian archers had broke the Libyan ranks, the chariots completed the victory and turned the battle into a massacre. This striking success brought much needed relief to Egypt on the west, just as the previous campaign had restored its prestige in the east. Meneptah, like his father, was ambitious to be known as a great builder, and like his father, he did not scruple to use the monuments of earlier sovereigns as a quarry from which to get a ready and almost inexhaustible supply of building material. To the student of the OT, Old Testament, he is, however, most important as being probably the pharaoh from whose rule the Hebrews escaped at the time of the Exodus. Who was this? Meneptah. Okay, so they're not saying it's Ramses, as most Christians etc. say. He was buried with his fathers at Thebes after a reign of much trouble and anxiety, especially for an aged man, during which the power of Egypt was maintained, although with difficulty. 2. It is sometimes stated that in his reign a Syrian obtained a position of power in Egypt much after the manner of Joseph in an earlier age. This statement is entirely without foundation and due to misunderstanding of the titles of Ben Ozine, the Syrian marshal of his court. Let's be that Henry Breasted, Cambridge. Not too sure what that is. Maybe antidote or something. Ancient History 2, page 169. After the death of Meneptah, the country fell into anarchy. There were various claimants for the throne, and none was able to establish his power over the whole realm. To add to the miseries of the situation, famine broke out, and the Libyans, perpetually hovering on the borders of the Delta, again began to force their way in, both as plunderers and as settlers. The country was saved by the rise to power of Setnakht around 1200, who succeeded in overcoming his rivals and establishing sufficient control over affairs to hand on his rule to his son Ramses III, the founder of the 20th dynasty. Under this monarch, the Egyptian military resources were reorganized in a great part upon the rather uncertain basis of foreign mercenaries. So they hired non-Egyptians, or people from everywhere else, in their armies and their ranks. In 1194, the new organisation was severely tested, for once again the Libyans invaded the Delta in great force, and in conjunction with them a numerous multitude advanced from Syria. Egypt was beset by land and by sea, but the resources of the pharaoh proved equal to the occasion, and on both elements the Egyptians were successful. Here's the buildings of Ramses II. Front view of the great rock temple at Abu Simbel. The front including the 4 colossal statues of Ramses II, each 65 feet high, or foot high, is carved in the living rock. Okay, but the resources of the pharaoh proved equal to the occasion, and on both elements the Egyptians were successful. The invaders from the north, however, still came on in great numbers, not so much by armies as by peoples, and in this period the last remnant of Hittite greatness seemed to have been submerged beneath the continual waves of passing hordes. Again and again heavy fighting was necessary to save the Palestinian and Libyan borders from being crossed, and again Egypt came out of the contest victorious. They kicked booty. Amongst the invaders who were thrust back were the Pulasati, known to history as the Philistines. For the coming of the Philistines, see below paragraph 150F. Okay. Ramses III was followed by a series of monarchs bearing the same name, each enjoying but a short period of government, and each had a desperate struggle to maintain himself. Meanwhile, the real power was passing into the hands of the high priest of Amon, whose succession had become hereditary. The enormous endowments lavished upon the temple by generations of pharaohs had at last made it the wealthiest and most considerable power in the state. Indeed, it seemed to overshadow even the royal power itself. The weakness in the central government soon manifested itself in Syria and Palestine. Within a generation of the death of Ramses III, the might of Egypt beyond its eastern boundary had become a thing of memory only. And down here, as a footnote, an interesting light is thrown upon the state of the Syrian coast towns and of their contempt for Egypt by the travels of Winamon, an Egyptian envoy who was sent to Byblus in the time of Ramses 12 or 11 to obtain cedar for the priests of Ammon. In the kingdom itself, this union, never far away from under weak kings, was already showing itself, and a rival kingdom was established in the Delta under a noble of Tanis, Uzoan, Nisu Beded, to give him his native name, but who was known to the Greeks as Smendes. The last feeble Ramses of the 20th dynasty, who still existed at Thebes under the shadow of the high priest, was at length quietly disposed, and the priest stepped into his place somewhere about 1100 BC. Although Herihor, the high priest, might be recognized as ruler at Thebes and in southern Egypt, his title to the north was not so strong, and here another pharaoh quickly seized his opportunity. At Tanis, Mendes, as we have seen, had already founded the 21st dynasty, and by the annalists he alone is regarded as a legitimate ruler. The relations between Tanis and Thebes are exceedingly obscure. Sometimes one and sometimes the other seems to possess royal power. The priests of Thebes built a fortress at Al-Heba, and so kept Upper Egypt fairly secure for themselves. The state of confusion came to the end when the Libyan mercenaries swept away the weaklings of both Tanis and Thebes and put on the throne Shishak of Bubastis, who founded the 22nd dynasty in 947. During this period, the settlement of Canaan was being hurried on, and the early Hebrew monarch monarchy was gradually establishing itself. The weak pharaohs of the 21st dynasty, about whom little is known beyond their names, were in no position to interfere. It is probable, however, that when David had driven out the Philistines, the latter put themselves under Egyptian protection. If so, David and his successor had too much work to do at home to trouble themselves about the matter so long as they were not attacked, and Egypt was too feeble to attempt any military aggression. Solomon, in the glory of his parvenu monarchy, whatever that means, was only too glad to take to wife a daughter of the ruling house of the ancient empire of Egypt, and her father gave as her dowry the troublesome town of Giza. Apart from Solomon's desire to gain prestige from matrimonial alliance, relations were likely to be friendly between him and Egypt. The latter depended very largely upon the goodwill of the Hebrew monarch for the carrying on of their trade. Solomon, as H.R. Hall says, derived much of the power that made him able to talk as an equal to Egypt from his control of the trade routes from Egypt to Babylonia and from the Red Sea to Syria. The Lord of Gaza, of Ezion Geber, and of Damascus was a powerful guarantor of peace and commerce. It has down here Ancient History 3, page 256. Not too short that one is. Shishak, born around about 947, died 925 BC. The founder of the new dynasty was of Libyan descent. His name in Egyptian is Sha'inka, and is frequently following the Assyrian vocalization pronounced Shishonk. His rise to power brought, though only for a time, a new spirit into the Egyptians and made them once again aggressive and dangerous to their neighbours. The nearest neighbour was Israel, and so it was upon Israel that the first blow fell. For some time Egypt had been a natural place of refuge for fugitives from Israel, as it remained to the very end. Compare Jeremiah 26:21-43:7. Amongst them during the reign of Solomon had been Jeroboam, an able and forceful young man. On the death of Solomon, whose wisdom and prestige had kept the kingdom together in some semblance of power, Jeroboam returned and raised the standard of revolt among the northern tribes of Israel. There can be but little doubt that his enterprise was not merely connived at, but also supported by Egypt. Shishak was quick to seize his opportunity and to fall upon the weak southern kingdom. Jerusalem was captured, and the lavish offerings which Solomon had made to the temple and the palace went to swell the spoil of the Egyptians. On his return, Shishak set up a vaunting inscription at Karnak, and no doubt felt himself the equal of Thutmose III or Ramses II. But this revival of former glories was but a feeble and transitory gleam, and Shishak himself did little more to extend it. He died probably in 925, a few years after his successful expedition. His son succeeded him, Osokin I, born 925 and died 89 BC. H.R. Hall thinks that he is really the mysterious Zerah, the Ethiopian, who invaded Judah and was defeated by Asa at Maresha, 2 Chronicles 14:9. It's got a double F there. If this identification is correct, the disastrous attack was the last attempt of Egypt to conquer Judah, and on its failure, the pharaohs of this dynasty seem to have settled quietly down into sleep and decay. There is an interesting possibility that they sent a contingent to help the allied Assyrian kings who fought against Shalmaneser III at Karkar. For this monarch mentions 1,000 men of Musri amongst his opponents. It is, however, much more probable that these were from Asia Minor than from Egypt. The later years of the 22nd dynasty saw a fresh attempt of the Theban priesthood to recover its supremacy, and as in the Tanite period, two rulers with very vague powers seem to have sat on rival thrones at the same time. The later Theban rulers were more fortunate, however, than the successors of Herihor, for the annalists recognise him as legitimate sovereigns and name their dynasties the 23rd dynasty. 2. Palestine in the 14th century BC. In order to understand the history of the Israelite people, it is necessary to know something of the previous history of the land which they came to possess, and to realize the various influences by which they were affected after the conquest. The Old Testament itself gives us some information as to the state of Palestine when the Israelites invaded it, but as this information was not written down till centuries afterwards, and as the ideas of later ages have been allowed to influence the writers, part of its value is taken from it. It is exceedingly fortunate, therefore, that we have much contemporary evidence for the state of Palestine in the pre-Exodus period. Part of the evidence comes from the result of excavations which have been carried on at various sites, the most important of which are Tel el-Hisi, the ancient Lachish, Giza Tanak, and Tel el-Mutusalam, the ancient Megiddo. And there's a footnote indication here. For a good general account of the discoveries, see Driver, Schweik, Lectures, and McAllister, A Century of Excavation in Palestine. Part is to be found in the tablets recently discovered prior to this book at Bukhaz, Kuwait, the ancient Hittite capital in Asia Minor. But above all, we are indebted to the content of the tablets, some 300 in number, discovered at Tel el Amarna, the site of the ruined city and palace of Amenhotep IV in Upper Egypt. So that verifies that they were found in Egypt, the Tel el Amarna letters, and not in Babylon. The tablet forms the state archives of the unhappy pharaoh and consists of letters received by himself and his father from a numerous and varied series of correspondence. Included amongst them are the kings of Babylon and of the Hittites, the governors of dependencies, Arab sheikhs, and even the lady, who shows a very modern kind of interest in high politics. Our respect for the culture and civilization of the ancient world cannot be vastly increased by even a slight perusal of these most interesting epistles, for the mention in them of quite trivial affairs makes it evident that communication was as easy and as regular amongst them as it was in the modern world in the middle of the last century, before the invention of the telegraph and the increased use of the steam engine. For the messengers, however, the matter was not quite so simple as for the correspondence, and it would not take any great amount of imagination to picture to ourselves the bearers of some of these weighty missives in danger of sinking under the burden of the affairs of Babylon in a literal and not a metaphorical sense. Footnote indication here. The substance of this and the following paragraphs is taken from this author's booklet, Modern Discoveries in the Old Testament, paragraph 15, number 14 in Little Books on Religion, SPCK. Many interesting and amusing sidelights of much value to the archaeologist and the general student are thrown on the life of the ancient world by these letters. For us, they are mainly important for the immense service which they have rendered to biblical scholarship by revealing so much of the conditions of Palestine before the Hebrew invasion. Anyone who is in any way familiar with the history of the Middle Ages can hardly fail to be struck, on looking through these letters, by the remarkable similarity which exists between the state of Palestine in the 14th century and that of Italy in the 14th century AD. Okay. Anyone who is in any way familiar with the history of the Middle Ages can hardly fail to be struck, on looking through these letters, by the remarkable similarity which exists between the state of Palestine in the 14th century BC and that of Italy in the 14th century AD. In each case, the country was under the nominal rule of an absent suzerain, whilst the actual power was in the hands of a number of petty despots. Compare Joseph 2 verse 2, 8 verse 1, 9 verse 1, 12 9. Or of municipalities, compare Joshua 9:11, ever ready to seize the opportunity of benefiting themselves at the expense of their neighbours. In further resemblance, the whole land was overrun by bands of foreign mercenaries, hired people, put into the armies, but like a foreign legion, who were as willing to serve a city whilst its money lasted as to turn and join its enemies in sacking it when it was no longer able to pay their hire. The pharaoh, like some of the emperors, cared but little for these things, so long as his tribute was duly collected and no great outrage against Egyptian rule was committed. The slaughter of a few Canaanites was a matter of little consequence. It didn't really bother them. The Canaanite cities, like those of Italy, were very wealthy, and the life of their citizens must have been exceedingly luxurious. We read in inscriptions of their chariots, of silver and gold, and many gold and silver articles, inlaid tables and other valuables are stated to have been taken by the Egyptians as spoil. So that's probably evidence that they were living it up. They had it made. They had it going on. It is quite possible that the Italian despots of the Middle Ages, who were famous as patrons of the fine arts, had their prototypes amongst the petty kings and governors of Canaan. One of the most interesting of these semi-independent local governors was Abdi Kiba of Jerusalem. This person had quarrelled with his mercenaries, and they had transferred their services to his rivals, to his enemies. The result was that Abdi Kiba found himself in difficulty. His numerous letters to the pharaoh do not seem to have met with much response, for the Egyptians were probably just as willing to have a mercenary chief as ruler of Jerusalem as a Canaanite prince. In addition, there seems to have been some considerable doubt about Abdi Kiba's own loyalty. In the following letter, he is defending himself against some charges of trying to become entirely independent. That's all detailed here. Another of his letters contains a very touching postscript. This postscript was doubtless accompanied by some more substantial expression of the writer's regard. Of the ultimate fate of Abdi Kiba we have no information. One of his last letters is sufficiently gloomy. The king no longer has any territory. The Hebrew have wasted all the lands of the king. If the royal troops come this year, the country will remain my lord the king's, but if no troops come, the territory of the king my lord is lost. The general impression we gather of Palestine is that of a land full of disorder and insurrections, and internally weak. Here and there Egyptian fortresses and garrisons still existed, and sometimes a spasmodic effort would result in some restoration of order. Very prominent in the battle are bands of Aramaean nomads, who are known as Sargaz, robbers. In the time of Abdi Kiba, however, these nomads were known as the Habiru, a word which has a close linguistic connection with Hebrew. The pharaohs of the new dynasty made some difference and repeated invasions of Palestine and Syria restored Egyptian prestige. Both Seti and Ramses II, in the age immediately before the Exodus, carried out successful expeditions into Palestine, and it is interesting to note that each of them makes mention of a certain people called the Asaru, a term equivalent to the Israelite tribe Asher, Asher being the descendant of Jacob in the Bible. Merneptah himself, in his Ode of Triumph, mentions a people of Israel amongst his victims. But this revival of Egyptian supremacy in Palestine was not of long duration, for although Ramses III invaded the territory west and south of the Dead Sea, his successors were compelled to let slip their hold on the country. According to the Old Testament, Palestine at the time of the first invasion was inhabited by a number of races. The two chief of these were the Canaanites and the Amorites, the former being the dwellers in the valleys and the latter in the mountains, Deuteronomy 1:7. In the list of races which recur not infrequently, example Joshua 11:3, 24:11, mention is also made of the Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites and the Girgashites, of whom very little that is distinctive is known, as well as of the great nation of the Hittites, who come in rather strangely among their lesser brethren. And there's a footnote indication down below. For the Hittites, see paragraph 2, FF above in Numbers, West Com, paragraph 89. Okay, the land of Palestine itself is of such importance in Hebrew history that some brief description of it is necessary. 2. Kent has described it as the first chapter in God's great volume of revelation inscribed upon the history of the Hebrew people. History of Hebrew people 1, page 24. The term Palestine is used rather loosely. In the wider use, it includes the whole territory from Lebanon in the north to Edom in the south, and from the Great Desert to the Mediterranean. In the narrower usage, the northern and southern limits are Dan and Beersheba, and the East Jordan territories are not included. This narrower country is about 140 miles long, some 90 miles wide in the south and only 25 miles wide in the north. The whole area is about 6,000 square miles. Palestine is not a rich land. It compares unfavourably with Syria in this respect, and the fact that the sea coast with its few ports was held by the Phoenicians and the Philistines during our period made the expansion of Israelite overseas trade impossible, except during the brief years when Judah was in a position to occupy the Red Sea ports. The snows of Mount Hermon seen from the Sea of Galilee. Well, that's quite... Oh, there we go. There's like snowy mountains over here. Snow-covered mountains. Quite an old photo, hard to see. Some parts of Palestine were very fertile, especially the plain of Estra Elion and luxuriant valley of the Jordan. In the latter, the growth of vegetation is still remarkable. Okay, and he's talked some more on that. Still trying to figure out why this person underlined quite a lot of these passages, these statements. There are great contrasts in the climate of Palestine due to the variety in its physical formation. More information on that. As the training ground for a people destined by God to play a predominant part in the religious history of the world, no better land than that of Palestine could have been found, for it is at once secluded and yet not isolated. It is secluded because it lies off the great highways which connect Egypt with Mesopotamia. It is not isolated because these highways run close to its territory, and some of the less important actually cross it. The chief routes are as follows. Looks like there's a person overlooking it. Looking down on the Dead Sea. I guess that's here. Quite a massive area. Okay, there's more on that area that you're talking about. Thus, the dweller in Palestine was kept in close touch with all that was going on in the world around him as the passing caravans brought their news as well as their merchandise, but he was sufficiently secluded to prevent his own culture and ideas from being overwhelmed by foreign influences. And it talks about Assyria and Babylonia. In the times immediately before our period, Assyria and Babylonia were kept away from the northeast of Syria by the people known as the Mitanni, and from Palestine itself by the desert. Assyria was meanwhile improving her internal conditions, digging new wells and erecting palaces. Externally, a policy of aggression led to struggles with Babylon, then under the Kassite dynasty. These encroachments were on the whole successful, although frequent outbreaks in Babylon and in Assyria itself rendered progress slower than otherwise it might have been. The rise of the Hittites in the early part of the 14th century BC brought about the fall of the Mitanni to the great benefit of Assyria, who immediately seized upon part of their territories. Encouraged by this success, Assyria made a further attempt upon Babylon under Enlil-nirari 1368 to 1346 and was completely victorious. The collapse of the Mitanni had, however, brought Assyria face to face with the Hittites, and progress towards Syria was still held up. Another attack on the Kassites in the reign of Adad-nirari I, 1305 to 1277 BC, however, was once again successful. The great soldier and builder Shalmaneser I, 1276 to 1257, further consolidated the growing empire and extended it towards the north. Under his successor Tukulti I, 1256 to 1207, considerable progress was made in the north west, and successes were gained over the Hittites, whilst on the other border Babylon itself was captured. In the next century, however, the Meshech of Old Testament seemed to have overrun part of the Assyrian territories. Meanwhile, Babylon was suffering from continual raids by the Elamites, culminating at last in 1169 by a movement sufficiently serious to overrun the whole dynasty. To the Kassites, who had ruled Babylon for nearly 6 centuries, succeeded the Pasha dynasty. This dynasty lasted only 132 years, but it included amongst its kings the great name of Nebuchadrezzar I, 1146 to 1123. He was able to carry on a successful, though desperate, war with Elam, whom he finally defeated in a great dust storm in which the opposing forces could hardly distinguish one another. The Elamites were glad to seek shelter in the mountains from the fierceness of the enemy and also from the unaccustomed heat. Against Assyria, his good fortune failed him, and he met with complete defeat at the hands of Ashur-resh-ishi I, 1127 to 1116, under whom the Assyrian power, after a period of decay, was once again lifting up its head. Under the next monarch, Tiglath-Pileser I, 1115 to 1102, Assyria, by one advance after another, succeeded in overpowering all her neighbours. The Moshki were driven out of Mesopotamia, and her arms were extended as far as the distant Mediterranean. The king claims that he took a ship of Avad and sailed forth on the sea, where he slew a dolphin. The power of Assyria was so threatening that even the pharaoh of the time sent presents, but the death of Tiglath-Pileser was also the signal for the loss of much of the conquered territory. Ashur-bel-kala, 1092 to 1075, the son, though not the immediate successor of Tiglath-Pileser I, erected certain statues in the land of the Amorites, and lived on friendly terms with Babylon, but his reign came to an end by rebellion or intrigue, and it was followed by a long period of obscurity, decay, and internal trouble. About this time, wave after wave of Arameans invaded Mesopotamia and even penetrated as far as Babylon. The 10th century found Assyria, if free from any immediate fear of invasion or conquest, yet reduced in territory, insecure in trade, exhausted by a long fight for existence. A new dynasty was founded by Ashur-rabi II around 1001 BC, and it seems to have lasted some 200 years, but the various kings are little more than mere names. Ashur-rabi is notable for the setting up of an image of himself on Mount Amanus, but soon after this feat all connections with the west was cut off by the capture of Mutkina by the Arameans and by their taking possession of Pitru or Pethor. The dynasty seems to have given itself to the improvement of the internal condition of Assyria and to the cultivation of trade. And here's a wall relief or a carving of the Hittite soldiers, a slab from Karkemish about 1000 BC. Okay, and it gives more information on the Assyrians and the Arameans, etc. By the look of it, here's another wall relief. Assyrians besieging a walled town, a relief from Ashur-nasir-pal's palace at Nimrud. Okay, and here's here that Shalmaneser III succeeded somebody else, 859 to 824. So great was the terror that had fallen upon the Arameans through the expedition of Ashur-nasir-pal that his son had little to fear from them. The natural desire of Assyria to expand, however, caused him to lead a number of campaigns across the Euphrates. These were never entirely successful. In 853, a large Assyrian army was checked at Karkar by a confederation of Syrian kings, which included Ahab of Israel. See the appendix, page 241 and 242. Page 242. The Allies managed to place in the field between 60 and 70,000 men and a large number of chariots. The Assyrians claimed to have inflicted immense losses upon them. Nonetheless, the action was not decisive in their favour. Another expedition was undertaken in 848 and again in 845, when a vast host of 120,000 men was led into Syria, but again without any decisive result being reached. At last, in 841, Jehu of Israel and other princes paid tribute, but Hazael, the usurper on the throne of Damascus, faced the might of Assyria alone at a battle in Mount Hermon, who was badly defeated, losing 16,000 men. Here, see appendix page 242. But Damascus itself resisted all Shalmaneser's efforts to capture it. A later expedition in 837 was equally unsuccessful. As far as Hazael was concerned, though he lost 4 cities in Tyre, Tyre, mentioned in the Bible, right? Zidon and Byblos paid tribute. To compensate for this lack of complete success in Syria, Shalmaneser made conquest to the north. By overcoming Cilicia, he obtained control of the road into Asia Minor, a great achievement for both military and commercial purposes, and so forth. It says here, as Mr. Sidney Smith points out, obscuring the glory of this vigorous monarch, Ashurnasirpal, in the eyes of his successors, and his achievements must still be considered the basis of Assyrian imperial power.